She confessed she made a terrible mistake marrying me and belonged with her ex instead, on our wedding night in the bridal suite. I'm still processing how someone can stand at an altar, say vows, and then completely unravel hours later. 4 years of what I thought was building something real with Paige, and it turns out I was just the safe choice while her heart belonged to someone else entirely. I'm Owen, 32, work as a commercial insurance broker here in Portland. Nothing glamorous, but I've built a solid practice analyzing risk and helping businesses protect what matters to them. Paige was 29, coordinated photography shoots for various clients around the city. We met through mutual friends at a wine tasting event, and she seemed impressed that I actually listened when she talked about her work instead of just nodding along. Our relationship developed steadily over 4 years, the kind of progression that felt natural and right. We talked about futures, shared goals, even bought a condo together downtown with views of the Willamette River. She seemed genuinely excited about our life together, always posting photos of us at restaurants or hiking trails with captions about finding her person. I proposed at the Japanese garden during cherry blossom season because she'd mentioned loving that spot. Her reaction seemed perfect, tears and excitement, and calling her sister immediately to share the news. The engagement period lasted 8 months of planning what we both agreed would be our dream wedding. We booked the Evergreen Valley Vineyard Estate, this stunning property about an hour outside Portland with rolling hills and mountain views that looked like something from a magazine. The ceremony was everything we'd envisioned: intimate gathering of 70 guests, perfect October weather. Paige looked absolutely radiant in her grandmother's vintage dress that she'd had altered. I remember standing at that altar watching her walk down the aisle thinking I was the luckiest guy alive. The reception at the Grand Hotel was flawless, great food, dancing, speeches that made people laugh and cry in all the right places. Everyone kept commenting on how perfect we seemed together, how obvious our connection was. Even my normally critical sister Carmen seemed genuinely happy for us. We left the reception around 11, both exhausted but glowing, headed to the luxury resort's bridal suite that overlooked the vineyard where we just promised to spend our lives together. That's when everything fell apart in ways I never could have predicted. Paige had been drinking champagne throughout the reception, nothing excessive, but by the time we reached our suite she seemed unsteady in more ways than just physically. She sat on the edge of the massive 4-poster bed and just started crying, not happy tears or emotional release from a big day, but deep, wrenching sobs that seemed to come from somewhere dark. I asked what was wrong, tried to comfort her, assumed she was just overwhelmed from the day's emotions. Instead, she looked at me with this expression of pure anguish and said she'd been thinking about Marcus all day, that marrying me felt like betraying her true feelings. Marcus was her ex-boyfriend from college, some guy who'd become a professional snowboard instructor living this adventurous lifestyle in Colorado. I knew about him peripherally, but Paige had always described that relationship as intense but ultimately incompatible. Sitting there in our bridal suite, she told me she'd never stopped loving him, that she'd chosen me because I represented security and stability while Marcus had captured her heart completely. She said watching our friends dance at the reception made her realize she was living a lie, that she belonged with someone who made her feel alive instead of just safe. The words kept coming like she couldn't stop herself, years of suppressed feelings pouring out in this devastating confession. She explained that Marcus lived spontaneously while I planned everything, that he challenged her while I supported her, that being with him felt like flying while being with me felt like settling. Every sentence was another knife twist, destroying not just our marriage but my understanding of our entire relationship. I sat there listening to the woman I'd just married explain how she'd been pretending for 4 years, how she'd convinced herself that mature love meant choosing the responsible guy over the passionate one. She kept apologizing between sobs, saying she never meant for it to happen this way, that she thought she could make herself feel differently about me. But standing at that altar saying vows had crystallized her realization that she was making the biggest mistake of her life. I didn't argue or plead or try to convince her otherwise. Instead, I walked to the closet and started packing my suitcase while she continued her devastating revelation about choosing security over love. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was using the risk assessment skills that attracted her to evaluate my own situation, and every indicator pointed to the same conclusion: cut your losses and walk away. My best man Felix initially thought I'd lost my mind when he saw me loading my car at 2 in the morning, still wearing my wedding suit minus the tie. He'd come looking for us after some guests mentioned not seeing us at the after-party in the hotel bar, probably expecting to find us celebrating privately or already asleep. Instead, he found me in the parking lot looking like someone whose world had just imploded, which wasn't far from accurate. Felix had known me since college, understood my methodical nature, so when I explained what happened in Paige's own words about loving Marcus and making a terrible mistake, he shifted from confusion to absolute fury on my behalf. He'd always been protective of our friend group, the type who remembered every slight and grudge, and hearing that Paige had essentially confessed to emotional fraud during our wedding night turned him into my fiercest advocate overnight. My sister Carmen's reaction was entirely different and completely predictable given her obsession with maintaining our family's reputation in Portland's professional community. She called me 6 times before I finally answered the next morning, demanding explanations and insisting I was overreacting to wedding day nerves or champagne-fueled emotions. Carmen worked in public relations for a major firm downtown, so her immediate concern was damage control rather than my emotional well-being, typical for someone who viewed personal relationships through the lens of social standing and networking opportunities. She kept repeating that successful marriages required compromise and understanding, that I should return to the hotel and work things out privately before our situation became public gossip. Meanwhile, Paige's family launched their own campaign of calls and messages, her parents and sister all insisting this was just cold feet magnified by alcohol and wedding stress. They painted me as abandoning their daughter in her moment of vulnerability, conveniently ignoring that her vulnerability involved confessing love for another man on our wedding night. The narrative they promoted positioned me as the unreasonable one who'd fled instead of fighting for our relationship, as if fighting for someone who'd explicitly stated she belonged with someone else made any logical sense. The scandal spread through our social circle faster than I anticipated, Portland's professional network being smaller and more interconnected than most cities our size. The reactions split dramatically along predictable lines, with most men expressing admiration for my self-respect and refusal to accept being someone's backup plan, while many women argued I should have stayed to work through Paige's confusion and emotional turmoil. These conversations happened in coffee shops, networking events, and dinner parties where people debated our situation like some fascinating case study in modern relationships. I found myself simultaneously defended and criticized by people who'd celebrated with us just days earlier, their opinions apparently more important than the actual facts of what Paige had confessed. Felix appointed himself my unofficial spokesman, correcting misconceptions and ensuring people understood that Paige had voluntarily admitted to loving someone else, not that I'd abandoned her over typical marital disagreements. His loyalty was both touching and necessary since I had no interest in defending my decisions to people whose opinions wouldn't change the fundamental reality of my situation. During this social chaos, I decided to investigate Marcus myself, curious about the man who'd apparently captivated my wife's imagination throughout our entire relationship. His social media painted a picture of perpetual adventure and athletic achievement, professional snowboarding competitions across Europe and North America, sponsored gear arrangements, and lifestyle photos that screamed expensive taste funded by someone other than himself. His Instagram featured mountain peaks, luxury lodges, and action shots that looked professionally produced, the kind of curated perfection that probably seemed incredibly appealing to someone stuck in Portland's routine-heavy lifestyle. The most infuriating discovery came from his posts on the day after our wedding, photos from Switzerland showing him at some international competition with captions about champions versus quitters that felt deliberately timed. Whether he knew about our wedding specifically or was just posting his usual motivational nonsense, the timing felt like salt in an already devastating wound, this guy living his dream life while mine fell apart partly due to his lingering influence over my wife's emotions. Paige's attempts to contact me escalated through every emotional stage imaginable, starting with panic-stricken voicemails the morning after I left, progressing to angry accusations that I'd abandoned our marriage without giving her a chance to explain, then eventually dissolving into pathetic pleading that made me grateful I'd trusted my instincts and walked away. Her initial messages focused on damage control, claiming she'd been overwhelmed by wedding emotions and alcohol, that her confession about Marcus didn't reflect her true feelings about our relationship or our future together. She insisted that marrying me had been the right decision and that her temporary emotional breakdown shouldn't invalidate 4 years of building something real together. The anger phase emerged when I didn't respond to her explanations, messages accusing me of being cruel and unforgiving, questioning how I could throw away our entire relationship over one night of vulnerability and confusion. She painted herself as the victim of my unrealistic expectations, suggesting that real husbands would fight for their marriages instead of running away at the first sign of difficulty or emotional complexity. These messages revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of what had actually happened, as if confessing love for another man on your wedding night was equivalent to leaving dishes in the sink or forgetting an anniversary. The pleading stage was honestly the most difficult to ignore, not because I felt tempted to return, but because her desperation was genuinely painful to witness even after what she'd done. She admitted that she'd attempted reaching Marcus through various snowboarding industry connections and social media accounts, only to receive complete silence that forced her to confront the reality of her situation. Her messages became increasingly self-aware as she acknowledged that I'd been right to leave, that she'd destroyed our relationship for an impossible fantasy that existed more in her imagination than reality. She confessed that Marcus had never given her any indication of reciprocated feelings, that their college relationship had ended because he'd been consistently unreliable and emotionally unavailable, exactly the opposite of what she'd found with me. Reading these admissions, I felt something unexpected, liberation rather than devastation. The woman I'd married had essentially confirmed that I'd been her backup plan, her safe choice while she harbored romantic fantasies about someone who'd never demonstrated genuine interest in building anything substantial with her. I'd spent 4 years being evaluated against a memory, competing with an idealized version of someone who probably didn't deserve the pedestal she'd constructed for him in her mind. Instead of feeling rejected, I realized I'd avoided a lifetime of being someone's second choice, constantly wondering if I measured up to her idea of what love should feel like. The practical chaos of untangling our wedding aftermath provided welcome distraction from the emotional complexity of our situation. Returning expensive gifts required delicate explanations to relatives and friends who'd traveled significant distances to celebrate with us, their confusion and disappointment adding another layer of embarrassment to an already humiliating situation. Canceling vendor agreements for services we'd never used resulted in partial refunds and cancellation fees that felt like paying for the privilege of having my heart broken in public. The honeymoon resort in Maui offered to reschedule rather than refund, their customer service representative clearly trained to handle various relationship disasters with practiced sympathy that somehow made the entire process more depressing. Our social network continued debating our situation with the enthusiasm of people watching reality television, some suggesting counseling could help us work through Paige's commitment issues, others recommending immediate annulment before our legal entanglement became more complicated. A few well-meaning friends proposed that I consider divorce rather than annulment, arguing that Paige deserved financial support during her obvious emotional crisis, a suggestion that revealed how little they understood about what she'd actually confessed to me that night. Paige insisted on an emergency meeting 6 weeks after our wedding disaster, claiming she had shocking revelations about Marcus that would completely change my perspective on everything that had happened between us and potentially salvage what remained of our relationship. She suggested we meet at Vintage Wine Bar, the cozy downtown Portland spot where we'd had our third date 4 years earlier, probably hoping the familiar setting would soften my resolve or trigger nostalgic feelings about our early relationship when everything seemed promising and uncomplicated. I agreed to meet her, partly out of genuine curiosity about what revelations she thought could possibly matter at this point given the fundamental nature of her wedding night confession, and partly because I wanted definitive closure on this chapter of my life before moving forward completely into whatever came next. She looked absolutely terrible when I arrived at the wine bar, obviously having lost significant weight over the past month and a half, her usual polished appearance replaced by someone who seemed to be barely surviving rather than thriving, dark circles under her eyes suggesting she hadn't been sleeping well since our separation began. Her nervous energy was immediately apparent as she sat across from me, fidgeting constantly with her wine glass and checking her phone every few minutes like she expected Marcus to materialize with some romantic gesture that would retroactively validate all her destructive choices. She started by apologizing again for her wedding night confession, acknowledging that she'd completely destroyed our relationship and hurt me in ways that probably couldn't be repaired or forgiven, but insisted that recent developments had given her crucial perspective on just how foolish and ultimately destructive her obsession with Marcus had actually been throughout our entire relationship. Then she dropped the bombshell that explained her desperate urgency for this meeting and her haggard appearance. 3 days after our wedding night disaster, when I'd packed my suitcase and walked away from our marriage, she'd impulsively bought a plane ticket to Colorado, where Marcus was currently training for some major international snowboarding championship competition. She'd been convinced that her confession to me had been a sign from the universe that she needed to pursue her true feelings regardless of consequences or practical considerations, that fate was pushing her toward the passionate love story she'd been denying herself by choosing stability over adventure. She'd spent hours tracking down his exact location through social media posts and snowboarding industry websites, discovering he was staying at an exclusive luxury mountain cabin near Aspen that served as a training base for professional athletes preparing for upcoming international competitions and sponsorship events. Her plan, such as it was, involved showing up unannounced and declaring her feelings in some grand romantic gesture, expecting that her dramatic sacrifice would somehow convince Marcus to abandon his current life and begin the passionate relationship she'd been fantasizing about for years while building what I thought was a solid partnership with me. The reality check came swiftly and brutally when she arrived at the training facility and discovered Marcus cohabiting quite obviously with a fellow snowboarding enthusiast named Brooke in what was clearly a committed, long-term relationship that had nothing to do with casual roommate arrangements. Brooke turned out to be a sponsored athlete herself, accomplished and confident in ways that made Paige feel immediately inadequate and out of place, exactly the kind of woman who naturally belonged in Marcus's adventurous world rather than just dreaming about it from her comfortable but routine life in Portland. When Paige finally encountered Marcus at the lodge's upscale restaurant after working up courage for nearly 2 days, appearing visibly distraught and desperate after traveling across the country to find him based on romanticized college memories, his reaction was everything she should have expected but clearly hadn't prepared herself for emotionally or practically. Marcus looked genuinely confused and somewhat annoyed by her sudden appearance, treated her like a barely remembered acquaintance from his distant past rather than someone he'd been secretly pining for, and seemed uncomfortable with her obvious emotional distress and completely unrealistic romantic expectations about their connection. But the story didn't end with that devastating restaurant encounter, and Paige's next revelation explained why she looked so completely broken down during our wine bar meeting weeks later. She confessed that she'd been secretly communicating with Marcus throughout our entire engagement period, exchanging messages through social media platforms and text conversations that had grown increasingly flirtatious and emotionally intimate over the months leading up to our wedding ceremony. These weren't innocent check-ins between old friends, but deliberately manipulative conversations where Marcus had been systematically feeding her romantic fantasies while carefully concealing the reality of his relationship with Brooke and his actual indifference to rekindling anything serious with her. The night before our wedding, while I'd been reviewing my vows and feeling grateful for the life we were about to build together, Marcus had sent her a series of messages that directly triggered her emotional breakdown in our bridal suite hours later. He'd written about missing their connection, wondering what might have been if they'd stayed together, suggesting that conventional relationships never captured the intensity they'd shared during college years together. These messages arrived while Paige was getting ready for our rehearsal dinner, filling her head with romantic possibilities just hours before she was supposed to commit her life to me permanently and wholeheartedly. She showed me screenshots of their conversation thread, and reading Marcus's calculated words made me understand how deliberately he'd manipulated her emotions without any intention of following through on the implications of his suggestions. He'd positioned himself as the passionate alternative to my stable but supposedly uninspiring love, painting their college relationship as some epic romance that society had forced them to abandon for practical considerations rather than the immature, inconsistent connection it had actually been. His messages were expertly crafted to make her question her choices without explicitly promising anything concrete, leaving himself plausible deniability while stoking her fantasies about what they could have together if she were brave enough to pursue real passion instead of settling for security. When Paige had materialized at his Colorado training facility, desperate and ready to sacrifice everything for the love story he'd been encouraging through their secret communications, Marcus's reaction revealed the true nature of his character and intentions. He acted genuinely shocked by her appearance and completely denied that their recent conversations had implied any serious romantic interest or intention to pursue an actual relationship together. He told her she'd completely misinterpreted friendly nostalgia as romantic encouragement, that he'd been simply reminiscing about old times without meaning to suggest they should abandon their current lives to be together again. Most brutally, he labeled her pathetic for destroying her marriage over what he characterized as casual conversations between old friends, suggesting she return to her husband and try to rebuild the life she'd apparently destroyed based on her own misguided interpretations of his innocent communications. The revelation that crushed Paige most completely was learning that Marcus had been sending similar nostalgic messages to multiple women from his past, maintaining a network of admirers who fed his ego and provided backup options for attention when his primary relationship hit rough patches or became routine. She'd spent our entire engagement believing she was the special exception, the one woman he truly regretted losing, when actually she was just another entry in his digital black book of former conquests he kept on emotional standby for validation and entertainment. Paige had spent several additional days after their restaurant encounter lurking around the snowboarding venues where Marcus trained, watching him interact with Brooke and other athletes, desperately hoping to see some sign that his rejection had been a defensive reaction rather than genuine indifference to her dramatic gesture. Instead, she witnessed their obvious happiness and natural compatibility, seeing how Brooke fits seamlessly into Marcus's world in ways that Paige never could have managed even if he'd been genuinely interested in rekindling their relationship. She finally acknowledged that her obsession had been entirely one-sided, that Marcus had never intended anything beyond stroking his own ego by maintaining her romantic interest while building his actual life with someone who shared his passions and lifestyle preferences. The humiliation of recognizing how completely she'd misread their entire dynamic, combined with the devastating realization that she'd destroyed a genuinely good relationship for an illusion, had sent her into the emotional spiral I was witnessing during our wine bar meeting. After hearing Paige's complete confession about Marcus's manipulation and her devastating trip to Colorado, I knew there was no possibility of reconciliation, but I also recognized an opportunity to protect myself legally from any future complications or financial claims she might attempt to pursue through divorce proceedings or spousal support arguments. I contacted a family law attorney who specialized in annulment cases and discovered that Oregon law included specific provisions for marriage fraud based on concealment of material facts that would have prevented the marriage from occurring if those facts had been disclosed beforehand during the engagement period. Paige's documented evidence of her secret communication with Marcus during our entire engagement, combined with her explicit wedding night confession about never truly committing to our relationship emotionally or mentally, provided a compelling legal case for annulment rather than traditional divorce proceedings that might have involved property division or ongoing financial obligations. The attorney was particularly interested in the detailed timeline showing Marcus's manipulative messages arriving the night before our wedding ceremony and Paige's immediate emotional breakdown in our bridal suite, suggesting deliberate premeditation and fraud rather than spontaneous wedding day anxiety, alcohol-induced confusion, or temporary emotional overwhelm that might be considered normal pre-marriage stress. Within 3 months of filing the appropriate paperwork and presenting our evidence, I successfully obtained an annulment declaring our marriage had never been legally valid due to fraud and concealment, essentially erasing the entire legal relationship retroactively and protecting me from any future claims on property, assets, retirement accounts, or spousal support obligations that might have complicated my financial future. Meanwhile, the scandal had completely destroyed Paige's freelance photography coordination business as word spread rapidly through Portland's surprisingly interconnected professional and social networks about her wedding night confession and subsequent desperate pursuit of her ex-boyfriend across state lines to Colorado mountain training facilities. Her clients began systematically canceling existing contracts and refusing to recommend her services to other potential customers, apparently concerned about her emotional stability, professional judgment, and reliability after hearing various versions of our dramatic story circulating through mutual acquaintances, industry connections, and social media discussions about modern relationship disasters. The photography and event coordination community in Portland was relatively small and tightly knit, so her hard-earned reputation for reliability, professionalism, and creative vision evaporated almost overnight as people questioned whether someone who would abandon her marriage for a romantic fantasy could be trusted with their important life events, business launches, and special occasions that required consistent performance and emotional stability. She was forced to retreat completely with her family to a small town in eastern Oregon where her parents had retired several years earlier, essentially starting over professionally and personally in a place where her public humiliation wasn't common knowledge and her professional reputation hadn't been completely destroyed by her personal choices, emotional breakdown, and subsequent obsessive behavior. But the consequences of her actions extended far beyond just Paige's immediate professional and personal situation, creating a destructive ripple effect that ultimately reached Marcus himself in ways that perfectly illustrated the toxic nature of his manipulative behavior and his ego-driven games with other people's emotions and relationships. Paige's obsessive behavior had actually intensified rather than diminished after their brutal Colorado restaurant encounter, and she began appearing uninvited at snowboarding competitions and training events around the world, apparently convinced that persistence and dramatic gestures would eventually break through his indifference and force him to acknowledge their supposed destined connection and romantic compatibility. She started showing up unexpectedly at venues in Europe, Canada, and various locations across the United States wherever Marcus was scheduled to compete, train, or participate in sponsorship events, creating increasingly uncomfortable situations that drew unwanted attention from other athletes, coaches, event organizers, and corporate sponsors who began viewing her as a potential security risk and professional liability. Marcus initially tried to handle the escalating situation quietly through venue security personnel and polite requests for her to stop attending events where he was participating, but Paige's behavior continued escalating to include disrupting his sponsor presentations with emotional outbursts, bothering coaching staff and other athletes with inappropriate questions about his personal life and romantic history, and even attempting to approach Brooke directly with dramatic claims about their supposed romantic connection and Marcus's allegedly true feelings about their college relationship. While Paige's life imploded and Marcus dealt with the consequences of his manipulation games, my own recovery and rebuilding process exceeded every expectation I'd had about moving forward after such a devastating betrayal and public humiliation. The annulment freed me not just legally but emotionally, allowing me to approach my future without the baggage of failed marriage or complicated divorce proceedings that might have haunted my dating prospects and financial planning for years to come. Within 6 months of finalizing the annulment, my insurance practice experienced unprecedented growth as my focus and energy returned completely to building the professional reputation and client relationships I'd been neglecting during my relationship with Paige and her constant demands for attention and validation. My analytical skills and attention to detail, the same qualities that had helped me recognize the hopelessness of fighting for someone who preferred another man, translated perfectly into expanding my business and earning recognition within Portland's competitive insurance industry for innovative risk assessment strategies and client service excellence. The senior partnership offer I received from my firm came with a substantial salary increase, equity participation, and the flexibility to work with high-value commercial clients who appreciated my thorough approach to protecting their business interests and personal assets from unforeseen complications. I used the financial improvement and emotional clarity to purchase a modern waterfront condo in Portland's Pearl District, a space that represented my new beginning and had no memories or associations with my failed relationship or wedding planning disasters that had consumed so much of my previous living situation. The condo featured floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Willamette River, an open floor plan perfect for entertaining the friends who'd supported me through my difficult transition, and a home office where I could build my expanding practice without distractions or reminders of past disappointments and betrayals. But the most meaningful change in my life came when I met Elena Rodriguez, a veterinary surgeon who worked at the prestigious Animal Medical Center downtown and approached relationships with the same careful consideration and genuine commitment that I valued in all aspects of life. Elena was 31, had built her own successful practice specializing in emergency animal surgery, owned her home, maintained close relationships with family and friends, and most importantly, chose to date me because she genuinely appreciated my character rather than viewing me as a safe backup option or financial safety net while harboring secret fantasies about someone else. Our relationship developed naturally over 8 months, built on shared values, mutual respect, honest communication about our goals and expectations, and the comfortable recognition that we were both ready for genuine partnership with someone who actually wanted to be there instead of settling or pretending enthusiasm while longing for different circumstances. Elena appreciated my tendency toward careful planning and attention to detail, qualities that made her feel secure and valued rather than suffocated or controlled, exactly the opposite of how Paige had characterized those same traits when comparing me unfavorably to Marcus's supposedly spontaneous and exciting lifestyle choices. When I told Elena about my annulled marriage and the circumstances that led to walking away on my wedding night, she responded with admiration for my self-respect and refusal to accept being someone's second choice, understanding immediately that fighting for someone who openly preferred another person would have been both humiliating and ultimately futile for everyone involved. She shared her own dating experiences with men who treated her as temporary entertainment while pursuing other women, helping me recognize that what I'd experienced with Paige was unfortunately common among people who refused to commit fully to available partners while maintaining romantic fantasies about unavailable alternatives. Our conversations deepened my understanding of the crucial difference between being someone's authentic first choice versus their practical settlement, wisdom that extended far beyond romantic relationships into friendships, business partnerships, and every area where genuine mutual respect and appreciation mattered more than convenience or social expectations. Elena and I became engaged after 18 months of dating, a timeline that felt perfectly natural rather than rushed or delayed, marked by a proposal that happened organically during a weekend hiking trip when we were discussing our shared vision for building a life together that honored both our individual ambitions and collective dreams. I maintained absolutely zero regret about walking away from Paige on our wedding night, understanding more clearly with each passing month that staying would have meant accepting a lifetime of being evaluated against Marcus's memory, wondering constantly whether I measured up to her idealized version of passionate love, and competing unsuccessfully with a fantasy that existed primarily in her imagination rather than reality. The contrast between Elena's genuine enthusiasm for our relationship and Paige's conditional acceptance of me as a safer alternative became more obvious as my new relationship flourished without the underlying tension and emotional reservation that had characterized my previous engagement period despite my failure to recognize those warning signs at the time.